off last time, by the way? Anybody know where we were? I have got in my notes that I think we left off. We did go to chapter 5. I think we got through the first few verses of chapter 5. Okay, that makes sense because I think that's where I was figuring we left off, by the way. So, here's where we pick up. Let me pray and then we'll start and we'll get into 5 and we're going to really make it we're going to go as far as we can. And the hard part is, like I said, some of it's not going to be as much explaining. We're just going to read it and talk about it. So I am going to try to be a little more special when we look at it. But the next few chapters are going to be pretty hard because it's just detail. So let's pray and then we'll get started. Heavenly Father, I thank you for tonight. Thank you for the privilege to be able to serve you, to understand your word better. And so I just pray that as we get ready to study, that you would open up our hearts to hear you clearly. So we just pray that you would illuminate the text and help us to be the best that we can in understanding it and use this for your glory. So we pray these things in your name, Jesus. Amen. All right, so we've got to the first few verses. And so we're going to we'll start with verse 6, and then we'll go from there. So here's what 6 says. Therefore, command that cedars from Lebanon may be cut down for me. My servants will be with your servants, and I will pay your servants wages according to what you say. For you know that not a man among us knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians. So that's just Solomon saying, hey, you guys are great at cutting down bunch of trees. Can you give us a bunch for construction of the temple? Then he says, when Hiram heard Solomon's words, he rejoiced greatly, and he said, blessed be the Lord today. He's given David a wise son to be over his great people. So this is just a little glimpse into God was faithful in giving Solomon wisdom. Hiram, this Gentile king, is even noticing that. And then he says, then Hiram said to reply to Solomon, saying, I heard your message, and I'll do everything you want regarding the cedar and cypress timber. My servants will bring the logs down from Lebanon to the sea, and I'll make them into rafts to go by the sea to a place that you indicate, and I'll break them apart there, and then you can take them away, and then you can meet my needs by providing my household with food. So here's what's essentially happening, and I hope these work, right? So not working. That one, let's see. Number 2. Oh my goodness. Are we really back to this? Oh, all right. There we go. All right. So here we go up here. This is like Tyre. And this is where Lebanon would be. This is where Hiram is. And so here they are. And they're a mountainous area up here. They've got a lot of trees. What they're doing essentially is they're going to be sending their logs down to get intercepted here by Israel, right at this part. And then what they'll do is they'll take that into Jerusalem. And so it's this kind of elaborate plan of sending down all your lumber through the sea to the spot that the Israelites are going to intercept it once it hits their territory, and then bring it in where they need to. They'll do all what they need to do with it once it gets into the land. But that's the plan there. Verse 10, so Hiram provided Solomon with all the cedar and cypress timber he wanted, and Solomon provided Hiram with 100,000 bushels of wheat as food for his household, and 110,000 gallons of oil from crushed olives. Solomon did this for Hiram year after year. And then the Lord gave Solomon wisdom as he had promised him. And there was peace between Hiram and Solomon. And the two of them made a treaty. So if you don't remember, last time we talked about some of those measurements, like of what a core was. And some of your translations will say, this is just to be reminded of, is 1 core equals 5 bushels. Still, that doesn't help many of us in here because we don't buy things based on the bushel today. But let's kind of get into this. So you've got what, 100,000, right? Bushels of wheat. Okay, and then what is it, 110 bushels of oil. Yeah. So here is kind of the math. And I'm trying to remember what I did in my head before, how to do this. But just to kind of grasp what we noticed when it talked about Solomon and having to feed his house, we found out that it was about, was it 28,000 pounds of 28,000 pounds of bread for his kind of for the need that he had in his town. So that's what they're feeding each time in there. So you'd heard about what were they bringing in for the rations for the people, and you'll see that's for each day, and that was in verses 22 to 25 of chapter 4. When you do the math of what it really is and what it comes down to is you're looking at probably that this is going to be close to 6 million. This could be 6 million pounds of wheat that would be sent over, and the other one is going to be it's a ton. I can't remember what that was about what they said on that, but regardless of when you're talking about how much wheat that they're putting in, you're looking at about 2/3 of what is required just for Solomon's kingdom. So Solomon had his daily rations, and when you do the math of each thing that they're bringing in for each year to feed Hiram and his men, that's the way that they're paying them. They're not paying them in gold or anything. They're paying them in things like wheat and oil. And one of the reasons is because they're a mountainous region, and you're not really going to have a lot of places for olive, I don't know if they're groves or whatnot, what the technical term is, and not a lot of places to grow wheat. And so they're asking for this food. But really what it's about 2/3 of what it's taken to feed his administration is what they're also sending up to Lebanon during this time frame. So it's a lot of stuff there. So notice what it says, verse 13. Then King Solomon drafted laborers from all of Israel, and the labor force numbered 30,000 men. And he sent 10,000 to Lebanon each month in shifts. 1 month they were in Lebanon, 2 months they were at home. And Adoniram is in charge of the forced labor. Solomon had 70,000 porters, 80,000 stone cutters in the mountains, not including his 3,300 deputies in charge of the work. And they supervised the people doing the work. And the king commanded them to quarry large, costly stones to lay the foundation of the temple with dressed stones. So Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders, along with the Gebalites, quarried the stone, prepared the timber and the stone for temple construction. All right, so let's look at this process that they have done now for this. So you've got this way that they're starting to enlist workers. And so you've got people, you've got forced workers. And so there's really what you've got are people, for the most part, who are going to be the slaves. And that's what you see in like verse 15. So these would have been people who were not Israelites that they're using. So in verse 15, you got 70,000 porters, 80,000 stone cutters. Those are the guys. And the porters are the burden bearers. Those are the guys who are carrying all the heavy loads, pulling everything. And you've got these guys, they got to cut stone because there's so much stone around. So if you go to that realm today, if you go to the Middle East, it's tons and tons of stone. But there's this other group right before that they list, and these people were Israelites. There's 30,000 of them, and this was actually an ancient Near Eastern system where you would, it was called corvée, and what you would do is you would take your people and you would essentially go for, back in those days, typically in the ancient Near East, it'd be 4 months forced labor, 8 months back at home. And so you get 1 month. So the way Solomon's doing is you get 1 month where you got to go work hard. and you get 2 months back at home to get to be back and do all the things you need to do while you're here. And that's the way the system works. So 1 month gone, 2 months on. And that was something you see pretty much happening in the ancient Near East as well. But the next one, verse 15, those are all people from different states around them, people who had become vassal states. They were not Israelite. These, because he didn't use Israelites to be perpetual slaves for this. Those were people all around. Instead of dying in warfare, they just said, we'll sign up, we'll take it, we'll do it. That's who these people are. And then you've got this incredible number, right? You see here that he's got 3,300 deputies who were in charge. And then there's another group that are even doing that as well. Another large number of those people that you'll see later on in chapter 9. Another set of guys who are spent just over the work. And then you've got these rare and costly stones. We're really not sure what the kind of stones were, the rare stones that they were using. And the dressed stones just means they were specially cut in such a way and how they were going to build the temple. And then there's this group right here, verse 18, this Gebalites. And these were people who were over in the Lebanon area who were helping out, it seems, as well. And so we've got right now just this massive labor force that's about to take on building of the temple. It's just setting the stage, and you get to see everyone's involved. This is something that's going to be pretty big. Now let's look at 6 and begin to see this. Now Solomon began to build the temple for the Lord in 480th year after the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt. Okay, now this is important. This is just a little side note. The text is telling us that when the temple is beginning to be constructed, it was 480 years after when the people left Israel, left Egypt. So you should be able to go back, if this is a timeline, right? So this is temple construction. We know that it takes 7 years, actually, to do the temple. So this would be, you'd be at this point, but you got to go back 480 years here. And this is when the Exodus is what it's telling us in the text. And so the text is making it very clear that they've been able to calculate 480 years later after leaving Egypt, the temple has started. And so you can actually kind of calculate when the year should be. There's a big debate about when the Israelites left Egypt, by the way. So all estimations of when the temple was built, the way that we kind of get there is we say that we believe it's probably done around 976. And so what we do is you go backwards from this date, 976. You go backwards from when it starts in 976 BC. And you go back 480 years, which should get us to 1446 BC. So give or take, this is the time frame that the text seems to be saying is when the Israelites left Egypt. The problem is a lot of people don't believe this to be the case. And if you watch that documentary that we did a few months back, most people, if they even do believe that Israel came out of Egypt, they think a lot of that could be fairy tales as well. They actually go for a number that's much, much later than this, probably the 1200s even. I just don't think you can do that. I think when you look at the text and you see, I think it's pretty clear that it's making a point that it's 480 years. I've got my students tomorrow at GCU. They're being quizzed on this very point because we're in Exodus right now. And I believe that you've got to take it at face value. Now, what people do when they like a later date, and there's a reason why they do that, it all really hinges on when Jericho fell. So the city of Jericho, the ruins are still there. And so you've had in its history different archaeologists that have come in. And so the first guys that came in were German and British, and they came in. And the British guy named Garstang came, and he actually dated the crumbling of these walls, these massive walls, and the fire that comes with them. He dates this massive destruction to, would you know, about 40 years after 40 years after this event. So we're looking at right when they're getting into the Israelites beginning to conquer the land. A lady later on named Kathleen Kenyon comes in, and she looks at the ruins, and based on the way that she dates, and really, when you're dating things, you're looking at a piece of pottery here, and you're looking at what kind of things are left in the camp. And so she says, this is obviously much, much later. And so what people have done is they've gravitated to that date based on what her findings were. I believe it was back in the 50s. And so everybody has been saying, no, the Exodus did not happen here. It happened much later. So then what people do is they say, well, maybe what they mean is 12. Maybe what they mean is 12 generations of 40. And so what's that? It's not meant to say literally a 480-year time period. They're just saying around 12 generations of people have come and gone since. And if that's the way you want to go, that's cool. But still, I think there's something to the years. I think they're giving us a time frame. The book of Judges also mentions that at least the people were in the land for about 300 years as well. That's Judges, I think it's 11, where it talks about that. But anyways, that's where we're at. So they're tying in the time frame, saying the temple is being built and it's intentional. We started as 480 years since the time that the people left. Now, here's what it says. Now, the temple that King Solomon built for the Lord was 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, 45 feet high. The portico in front of the temple sanctuary was 30 feet long, extending across the temple's width, 15 feet deep in front of the temple. He also made windows with beveled frames for the temple. Now, here's what I want to do. I want to stop here because I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to throw the slides up because at this point, it's just really impossible to really track because it's not narrative now. There is no narrative that's going on here except just instructions or details for how we built the temple. And so if you're like me, you need to see it. And I do not want to put you through me trying to draw anything for you. It will not be to scale. But I've got some great slides that I actually purchased that I use for when I do my Old Testament lectures that are all on the temple. And so what we'll do is I'm going to just kind of show you through the text for just a moment. We're going to blow through some of this stuff. I'm going to point a couple things out. And then what I'll do is we'll change gears and we'll start to go through some of the slides. And whether we can get through all the slides or not, that'll be something to think about. But here's what I want to point out tonight in this lecture. So as you start to read through chapter 6, you're starting to see a couple things. Like, first off, I want you to look at verse 7. It says, now the temples used finished stones cut at the quarry so that no hammer, chisel, or any iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. So one of the things that they've done is you've got to recognize they have cut everything already to measurement way away so that by the time they get to the temple, they're just fitting. It's almost like fitting puzzle pieces. And there's a reason for that. Anybody want to guess probably why that is the case? Why is it that they didn't want to use hammers and chisels once they got there?
Make a lot of noise in a holy place.
Exactly. You got a holy place and you want to be quiet. If you came out of maybe a high church background or even a Catholic background, there's a lot of silence when you go in. A lot of silence. And at this place, they're saying, we're not going to make any noise. We're going to do this as quietly as possible as we are building up this temple. So that's something important to know, just how intricate that we're not just seeing a bunch of stuff, bunch of grunt work happening. I mean, they're bringing in some pretty impressive stones that have been cut, large stuff, valuable things. But what we also need to see is that it's all being done masterfully and all pre-cut, ready to roll. Couple other things you need to see here. Verse 11. The word of the Lord came to Solomon. As for this temple that you're building, if you walk in my statutes, observe my ordinances, and keep all my commands by walking in them, I will fulfill my promises to you, which I made to your father David, and I'll dwell among the Israelites and not abandon my people Israel. Now, here's what's interesting about this is God is now, once again, he's qualifying what Solomon needs to do. So in 2 Samuel chapter 7, the promise is given that God is going to bring up a descendant of David who will rule forever. He will rule forever on David's throne. So, and then there's this piece about how and there's some foreshadowing that there are going to be some guys who are going to come along who are going to get punished. They're going to be beaten as a result of their disobedience. So God now is reframing the promise to Solomon. Because in Genesis, you see this often that here's the promise I made to Abraham. I'm going to clarify and give it to you, Isaac. I'm going to give it to you, Jacob. So here he is. He's clarifying what this promise and how it relates to Solomon. And Solomon, it appears, thinks that he might be the guy. Solomon, by all accounts, probably looks at himself as the fulfillment. I'm going to build this temple, and I'm going to reign on my father's throne. But what the author is doing right here, right now, it doesn't make much difference to us. But for the person who already knows the history, the author who already knows how this story ends, that's a really important line because it's showing that this is conditional for you, Solomon. You're not the guy simply because you were born of David. You better act and obey and follow through and be faithful if you want this, if you want to reign on this throne. And what you find out is Solomon does not. But right now, things seem pretty great. I mean, he's building this temple, and that's all we really, we really know in the story. Look at the next part here. You'll see some of the things that he does, and we'll see that in the slides. Everything that's going on is they've got wood, and then everything is going to be essentially inside is going to be gold plated. They're going to cover with gold. So you'll see it's not only is it put together really well, but now it's going to be super expensive and super valuable. Here's something that I think will be interesting to point out to you in just a second. So you'll see that you'll get into, now I want you to think about this for just a moment. Look at verse 23. So 23, I want you to read and look at what it's saying here. Look at 23, and it says this: in the inner sanctuary. So this is the Holy of Holies. Now we'll see slides. I keep promising you slides. I promise. But maybe I will. Maybe I can see if I can get you a picture for just a moment of the slides. There's the tabernacle. No, move on. Here we go. No. All right, here we go. Let's look right here. Okay, so no, we haven't made it to the Holy of Holies there yet. But in the Holy of Holies, that you notice, what does it say about 23? Okay, no, that's still the holy place here. I'm going to go back to all these, I promise, and talk with you about them. But what does it say? Here we go. Most holy place. Notice what it says in here. He made 2 cherubim, 15 feet high out of olive wood. One wing of the cherub was 7 feet long, and the other 7.5 feet long, and the wingspan was 15 feet from tip to tip. So each wing is 7.5 feet long. And notice what it says. The second cherub was 15 feet. Both cherubim had the same size and shape. The first cherub was 15 feet, and he put the cherubim inside the inner temple. Since their wings were spread out, the one's wing touched the wall, while the other cherub's wing touched the other wall in the middle of the. Okay, so yeah, they touched the wall, and then while the other second cherub's wing touched the other wall in the middle of the temple, their wings were touching wing to wing, and he overlaid the cherubim with gold. So you've got this image of, and they don't show it well here, but in this temple, you've got 2 cherubim, and here's the room. and you've got one wing touching here, and here he is, and he's got his other wing here, and you've got the other wing here, and I got to move my wall back to here, and you've got that. So they're taking over the entire room, and their wings are touching in the middle. Yeah.
The Holy of Holies was 30 feet square.
Yeah.
That's why they touched the wall.
Exactly. So they filled up the room. Let me ask you a question. This is why I didn't want to show you these things. Let me ask you a question. Does two cherubim ring a bell to anything in your mind? Think about this for just a moment. Where do you remember hearing about two cherubim? Okay, so I want you to. I don't think. Now this is a mistake. This is what I drew as a mistake. But I don't think that the imagery that you begin to look at here, it is not there arbitrarily. It's not like they just had a fascination with things. So I want you to think about, we had two cherubim here, and here they are. They're in the most holy place. Their wings are there kind of right off, almost kind of guarding things. And the first time that you ever hear about them is exactly right. You hear about them where? You hear about them in the Garden of Eden. And so you see this. Let me just read this to you in Genesis 3:24. And it says this in Genesis 3. Here's what it says. So he drove man out, and he stationed the cherubim and the flaming whirling sword east of the Garden of Eden to guard the way to the tree of life. Okay, so I just want you for just a moment to entertain that we have some garden imagery that may be popping up in this temple. Okay, let's look at a couple other things as we consider this. Okay, couple other things. So we have some cherubim there. Look at verse 29. He carved all the surrounding temple walls with carved engravings, cherubim, palm trees, flower blossoms. Okay, so we've got some plants that are now kind of being involved here, being talked about. When we skip over to chapter 7, there's a couple other things that you start to notice that are put in there. So, for instance, you get to this basin, right? And you find here you've got some gourds that have been put in, but now you got 12 oxen that are now involved with this. So you got some animals that are now being seen here. So you've got some plants, you've got some animals that are involved here. You'll see other places where you'll see some things like pomegranates that are carved into there. And so what you begin to notice is there's a lot of imagery here it appears to be, like, for instance, if you look at 7:20, it says, the capitals on the two pillars were also immediately above the rounded service next to the grating, and 200 pomegranates were in rows circling the capital. Remember, these are patterns that were given for this. So I want you just to keep in the back of your mind, okay, I got pomegranates, and I've got two cherubim that are guarding my Holy of Holies. I've got imagery on the walls of cherubim and trees and all this stuff. And so I want you to think for just a reason, what might be the point that there's so much? And I'm going to say, I believe it's garden imagery. I believe there's a reason. In fact, my daughter was having a pomegranate the other night, and I'm one of the opinion that this is just a guess. That I believe that the original fruit that Adam and Eve had taken, that might have been either that or the tree of life, might have been one of those, probably like a pomegranate of some sort. And I don't see you biting it. I don't know how they would have bitten it, but I think a pomegranate must have been involved there because of the use of pomegranates and how they see it in this imagery. I want to ask for just a moment, though. Why do you think the temple would have so much garden imagery involved in its construction?
dwelt with man in the garden first.
Okay. So what do you think that's pointing to, Joanne?
This is where God said he would dwell with man again. So
You're right on. You're spot on. So there is a correlation that's being built. And what this does actually is I think this also helps us to clarify and understand what's going on in the first two chapters of Genesis. The two chapters of Genesis are man is able to boldly approach a holy God and enjoy fellowship with him and live amongst him. That is lost by the third chapter of the Bible. It's not regained. In fact, once you get to Exodus 19, it almost appears that God's about to restore that with the people of Israel. And then I believe it's verse 16, you find out that they fear. And then chapter 21 later on tells us that they say, have somebody else go between you, God, and us. Have a mediator between us. And God had already told them early on that I was going to make them a kingdom of priests. And instead, what they end up with is a kingdom with priests because they don't want to come before God. And so what you have is now you have the tabernacle and the way to approach God. And then ultimately you get this temple and you begin to see that it is starting to show us once again, this is what that Holy of Holies is. This is what the temple is. It's where God is going to reside and be a presence amongst his people. But granted that the issue is that there's only a few people that can ever even be near him in that temple. And there's only one guy who could even go in once a year back here. And that's it. But it is something to think about as you begin to realize. And I think once you grasp the imagery, the garden imagery that is going on inside this temple, you begin to start to make the connections of what has actually been talked about in the first two chapters of Genesis. It is not so much a story, even though it is, about God creating the heavens and the earth, but it's about God selecting a place on earth that he is going to now live amongst his people. Now, I love those first two chapters because those first two chapters look almost parallel to the last two chapters of the Bible, which is where God is once again in one location on earth going to now live amongst a city of his people, because at this point, there's not just two people, there's millions upon millions who now live with him. And once again, you've got that garden imagery that's all over those last two. But in the temple at this point, that's it. You've got kind of a hearkening back to what was and what it was like when man got to live amongst God. And now that's found inside the temple, but nobody else has access like that. And it would have been a sight to see. I mean, one guy was reading about this. It's like going into the Sistine Chapel, and you're just in awe of all these biblical scenes. You would go in, and you're in awe of all these scenes from the garden, essentially, of what that's meaning to show you, which is we had it, and now that same God is here, and he's residing amongst his people again. But it's not the same. It really isn't. It sets you up for kind of waiting for when you can. So that's what I wanted to show you. Some other things. I want to give you one other thing, and here's what we're probably going to do. Okay, I baited you with slides tonight, but I'm not going to use slides. I got to stop because we're not going to get as much time. But here's what I am. I'm going to point something else out to you, and then we'll stop with that. And then next week, what we'll do is we'll just go through the slides. I'll put the big stuff up. We'll go through and we'll walk through the whole temple together, and we'll talk all about these chapters, as instead of doing kind of a flyover view of them. I want to show you one other thing, and I want you to look at chapter 7 now, the first few verses. So let me go just right up before, and then we'll go back into 7. Let me show you in context the verses that have been going on. The foundation of the Lord's temple was laid in the 4th year, in the month of Ziv, in his 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month. The temple was completed in every detail and according to every specification. So he built it in 7 years. So it pauses for a moment because chapter 7 is going to give us a lot more details about stuff involved with the temple. So now we get into chapter 7 and notice where the narrative picks up. Solomon completed his entire palace complex after 13 years of construction. And he built the house. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon, and it was 150 feet long and 75 feet wide and 45 feet high on 4 rows of cedar pillars, and the cedar beams on the top of the on the top of the pillars, and it was paneled above with cedar at the top of the chambers that rested on the 45 pillars, and 15 per row. There were 3 rows of windows facing each other in 3 tiers, and all the doors and doorposts had rectangular frames, the openings facing each other in 3 tiers. He made the hall of the pillar 75 feet long and 45 feet wide. The portico was in the front of the pillars, and a canopy with the pillars was in front of them. He made the hall of the throne where he would judge, the hall of judgment. It was paneled with cedars from floor to the rafters. Solomon's own palace, where he would live, in the other courtyard behind the hall, was of similar construction. And he also made a house like this for Pharaoh's daughter, his wife. Then he goes on to say, all these buildings were of costly stones, cut to size, sawed with saws, on the inner and outer surfaces, from the foundation to coping, and from outside the great courtyard. The foundation was made of large, costly stones, 12, 15 feet long, and above were also costly stones cut to size, as well as cedar wood. Around the great courtyard, as well as the inner courtyard of the Lord's temple, the portico of the temple, were 3 rows of dressed stone and a row of trimmed cedar beams. I don't know if you saw, but there was a transition in there that we started talking about Solomon and then jumped right back into, we're now talking about the foundation laid for the temple of costly stones. So I want you to think about this, because anytime the authors do this, there's a reason behind this, okay? So chapter 6 is primarily all temple. Then we get to chapter 7, and we've got some verses that start, and it's Solomon's home. And then we go back into temple. Almost as if this has been inserted into the narrative, into the story, breaking it apart for a moment. And when they do that, they do it for a reason. It's not like the writer has been writing it down, and as he's putting all the temple stuff together, he accidentally pulls in Solomon's measurements really quickly and then forgets where he was at and puts it in. Because you would think, what are we going to deal with Solomon right now? Can we deal with Solomon later? Let's deal with Solomon's house at the end of all of this. Why shove him in here? Anybody got a guess for why you do this? What do you think?
Sounds like Solomon's on an ego trip in the middle of constructing a temple.
There you go. And why do you say that, Bill?
The size of his house, for one thing.
His house is bigger, because you start to look at the temple, right? And you start to begin to think about how big it is and how wide it is, right? And so here are some of the measurements of the temple, right? So you've got, with the temple itself, here are some of the measurements here. You've got 30 feet. Now this is the Holy of Holies, right? Okay, right here it says 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, 45 feet high. That is. So let me draw this for you. I have to do this. I'm sorry. Okay? It's not going to look pretty. So here's the temple. Okay? And so it is 90 feet wide, 30 feet there. So let's put 90, 30, and then we'll do 3-dimensional. Something like that. I don't know what that is. That's 45 feet tall. Okay? Sorry. That's that. Okay? Now we skip over and we look at his, right? And so Solomon's home. is what? And we find out that it is 150 feet long. And it is what? 75 feet wide. And then we've got that, whatever that is, 45 feet tall. So they're same height. Maybe they had a building ordinance in Jerusalem. He just couldn't pay off the guy, you know. But do you understand? I mean, you're almost double the size of his home compared to the temple. And did you catch in just those verses, the end of chapter 6 tells us how long did it take to build the temple? 7 years. How long does it take the next verse to build Solomon's house? 13, almost double the amount of time he takes to build his home. Yeah.
God told him how big to make the temple.
Yeah.
It was his discretion on how big to make his home.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, but you begin to see that's another reason why it should just cause you to pause. I know that, like, for instance, I've been teaching on the Pentateuch at GCU. And so we've been, we took like 8 weeks in Genesis, and it's a 16-week class. I got 4 more books to get through. And so we're reading through, and you start to get into the Joseph stories at the end of Genesis. And right in the middle of the Joseph story is this boom, right out of nowhere is a story about Judah. And then it just goes back on to the Joseph stories. And so you would sit there and you'd say, that was kind of random, right? But what you don't realize until you get to the end of the book is that when Jacob is blessing his sons, Judah is the son who is given the authority in the family. So Joseph, you find, is going to be given the blessings of the firstborn. He's going to be given the abundance. He's going to be given all of that, the fruitfulness. In fact, his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, have a huge chunk of land allotted to them. So much so that when the kingdom split, they essentially split between, and they call themselves Judah and Ephraim sometimes. Essentially, Joseph's family kind of becomes synonymous with all the other tribes. But it's interesting, at that time, Judah was not really on the forefront of anyone's mind. And it was only that quick insert of that story that you think, why focus on this guy? We're in the Joseph stories. Joseph's the main guy. And what the writer was doing was steering your attention to say, this broke the pattern for a reason. I want you to pause, and I want you to keep Judah in the back of your mind. And then you find out at the end of the book, there's a reason why, because Judah is going to be the king. Well, he's not the king, but he's going to be the ruler of his brothers, and kings will come through him. And so it's the same thing as you begin to read these stories. And right now it's all details. And then boom, at the end, it starts as, oh, by the way, here's a little bit about Solomon's house. And then boom, let me get right back into the rest of the temple. And it just causes you to stop and shakes you for just a moment to say, wait a second, why? And it's just another little thing the writer throws out there just to say, hey, think about this, and just shelve that away for another time. Okay? So that's where we are at this point. We will do next week, we'll do a full discussion. We'll go through all the slides on what the temple would have looked like. We'll look at all the measurements. We'll try to grasp it all together. But I wanted you to look, and really I wanted to kind of go through these 2 chapters for the sake of just kind of building that up and talking to you about some important theological points that are in there. So let me stop this now, and let me take some questions. If there's anything we want to ask, anything that you want